A young black boy named Daniel finds a wallet on his way to school, belonging to a wealthy white man, Mr. Carter. Hours later, the police and Mr. Carter show up at his school. What could Daniel have possibly done wrong? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Daniel Thompson woke up to the soft, comforting voice of his mother calling from the kitchen. "Rise and shine, sweetheart," she called from their tiny, modest apartment. The smell of eggs and toast filled the air, making Daniel's stomach growl. He stretched and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, glancing around his small room, where posters of his favorite basketball players decorated the peeling walls. He quickly dressed in his slightly worn but clean school uniform. He appreciated how hard his mom worked to keep their clothes looking presentable, even though they didn't have much. "Coming, Mom," he yelled out cheerfully, his voice filled with the happiness that seemed to follow him everywhere. In the kitchen, his mother, Lisa, was already dressed in her work uniform for her job as a waitress. She looked tired, but when she saw Daniel, her face lit up. She kissed his forehead and said, "Eat up, baby. You've got a big day ahead." Daniel sat down at the small kitchen table and ate his simple breakfast, savoring each bite. "Thanks, Mom, this is great," he said, showing the gap in his smile from a recently lost tooth. As they ate together, his mother reminded him of their family motto. "Remember, honey, it's not what we have, but who we are that matters." Daniel nodded with a serious expression. "I know, Mom. I'll make you proud." After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his backpack and left for school. The neighborhood was already buzzing with activity. He waved to Mr. Johnson, the old man who always sat on his porch, and high-fived his best friend, Jamal, who lived next door. As Daniel walked to school, he felt at home in his neighborhood. He loved the sense of community. Despite the worn-out buildings, the corner store with its faded sign, and the park where kids played basketball after school, that cool autumn morning, Daniel's mind was focused on his upcoming math test. He kicked a pebble down the sidewalk, mumbling multiplication tables to himself as he walked through the familiar streets. The sounds of cars passing, people heading to work, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery made him feel comfortable and at ease. Suddenly, something on the sidewalk caught Daniel's eye. A dark object lay on the ground, partly hidden by fallen leaves. Curious, Daniel hurried over to it. As he got closer, he realized it was a wallet, sleek, black, and made of expensive-looking leather. Daniel's heart began to race as he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He looked around, but no one seemed to be searching for it. Gently, he opened the wallet, hoping to find some identification. What he found made his eyes widen. Inside were several crisp $100 bills. Daniel had never seen that much money in his life. For a brief moment, Daniel thought about what he could do with the money. He could buy new shoes for school, maybe take his mom out for a nice dinner, or even get a basketball hoop for the neighborhood kids. But those thoughts quickly faded. He remembered what his mother always told him. "It's not what we have, but who we are that matters." With a deep breath, Daniel flipped through the wallet and found a driver's license. The name on it made him freeze. Thomas Carter. Mr. Carter was a well-known businessman in the city, famous for his wealth and success. What was his wallet doing here in Daniel's neighborhood? And what should Daniel do next? For a moment, Daniel stood there, torn between the temptation of the money and the lessons his mother had taught him. He thought about how hard she worked, how much they needed the money, and what a difference it could make in their lives. But then, with a determined sigh, he closed the wallet and slipped it into his backpack. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant being late for school. Standing on the sidewalk, Daniel looked at his watch. He was already running behind, but he couldn't let that stop him. This was more important. He closed his eyes for a second, thinking about his mother and the values she had instilled in him. Honesty was the most important thing. Daniel opened his eyes with resolve. He knew Mr. Carter's company was downtown, about a mile away. It would be a long walk, but Daniel didn't mind. He was determined to do the right thing. As he walked, Daniel thought about what he would say when he arrived. Would Mr. Carter believe him? Would he be angry that Daniel had opened the wallet? A nervous sweat began to form on Daniel's palms, but he kept going. passing stores as they opened for the day and watching people hurry to work. A few folks glanced at him, probably wondering why a young boy wasn't in school. But Daniel didn't care. He knew he was on the right path, and that was what mattered. When Daniel finally reached the towering building where Mr. Carter's office was, his heart pounded. The skyscraper seemed to touch the sky, its glass windows reflecting the sunlight. It was so different from the buildings in Daniel's neighborhood. He took a deep breath, feeling a bit out of place, and walked up to the entrance. The lobby was huge, with high ceilings and marble floors that sparkled under a giant chandelier. Daniel had never seen anything so grand. He walked to the front desk, where a receptionist with perfect hair sat. She looked up at him in surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but confused. Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm here to see Mr. Thomas Carter," he said softly. The receptionist raised her eyebrows. "Do you have an appointment?" Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am, but I found his wallet, and I need to return it." The woman's expression softened. "That's very honest of you," she said with a smile. "Let me see what I can do." She made a quick phone call, and as Daniel waited, he looked around the room. The lobby was so different from his neighborhood, where things were older and a little run down. Everything here was clean, bright, and new. He couldn't help but think about how out of place he felt. After a few moments, the receptionist hung up and smiled at Daniel. "Mr. Carter will see you now. Take the elevator to the 30th floor." Daniel nodded, his heart racing again. As he rode the elevator up, he watched the numbers climb higher and higher, feeling like he was entering another world entirely. When the doors opened, he stepped out into a hallway that was lined with expensive-looking paintings and soft carpet that felt strange under his worn shoes. A well-dressed woman met him at the elevator and smiled warmly. "You must be the young man who found Mr. Carter's wallet," she said kindly. "Please follow me." Daniel followed her, his nerves growing as they walked down the hallway. They stopped in front of a large wooden door. The woman knocked gently before opening it and announcing, "Mr. Carter, the young man who found your wallet is here." Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped inside the office. It was bigger than his entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. Behind a large desk sat Mr. Thomas Carter, a serious-looking man in his 50s. He stood up and looked at Daniel with a mix of curiosity and surprise. "So, you're the honest young man who found my wallet," Mr. Carter said, his voice deep and calm. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the wallet from his backpack. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I found it on the sidewalk and thought I should return it to you." Mr. Carter walked around his desk and took the wallet from Daniel. He examined it carefully before nodding. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, his eyes shifting back to Daniel. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel Thompson, sir," Daniel replied, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Carter studied him for a moment. "Tell me, Daniel, why did you return the wallet? There was a lot of money in here." Daniel looked up at Mr. Carter, his eyes full of sincerity. "It was the right thing to do, sir. My mom always taught me to be honest, no matter what." Mr. Carter's expression softened as he listened. The receptionist, with a polite yet puzzled expression, asked, "Can I help you?" Daniel swallowed hard before answering in a quiet voice, "I'm here to see Mr. Thomas Carter." His voice was barely above a whisper, and the woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Daniel shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am, but I found his wallet, and I need to return it to him." Her expression softened, and a look of surprise mixed with admiration crossed her face. "That's very honest of you, young man. Let me see what I can do." As she made a phone call, Daniel took in the surroundings. Everything around him looked so clean, modern, and new. Nothing like his neighborhood, where the buildings were old and worn. He couldn't help but imagine how his mom might feel in a place like this, just as out of place as he did. A few minutes later, the receptionist hung up the phone and smiled. "Mr. Carter will see you now," she said. "Take the elevator to the 30th floor. His assistant will meet you there." Daniel's nervousness returned as he walked towards the elevator. As the doors closed and he began to rise, he watched the floor numbers go higher and higher, feeling a sense of just how far he was from home, not just physically, but in another world altogether. When the doors opened on the 30th floor, Daniel stepped out into a world of luxury. The hallway was lined with plush carpet, and expensive-looking paintings hung on the walls. He felt small and out of place, his worn sneakers sinking into the soft flooring. A woman, smartly dressed, approached him with a warm smile. "You must be the young man who found Mr. Carter's wallet," she said kindly. "I'm his assistant, Miss Parker. Please follow me." Daniel nodded, still unable to find his voice, and followed Miss Parker down the hallway. They passed offices with glass walls and sleek furniture, the sound of her heels echoing through the quiet, pristine space. Soon they stopped in front of a large wooden door. Miss Parker knocked gently before opening it and announcing, "Mr. Carter, the young man who found your wallet is here." Daniel's heart raced as he stepped into the office. It was enormous, bigger than his entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. Behind a massive desk sat Mr. Thomas Carter, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s. Mr. Carter stood up, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "So, you're the honest young man who found my wallet," he said, his voice deep and commanding. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached into his backpack, pulling out the wallet. "Yes, sir," he said softly. "I found it on the sidewalk this morning. I knew I had to return it to you." Mr. Carter walked around his desk and approached Daniel, taking the wallet and inspecting it carefully. After a moment he nodded. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, looking back at Daniel with curiosity. "What's your name, sir?" "Daniel Thompson, sir," Daniel replied, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Carter raised his eyebrows slightly. "Daniel," he repeated, as though testing the name on his tongue. "Tell me, Daniel, why did you decide to return the wallet? There was quite a bit of cash in here." Daniel looked up at Mr. Carter, his eyes wide with sincerity. "It was the right thing to do, sir. My mom always taught me to be honest, no matter what." Mr. Carter's expression softened as he listened to Daniel's words. He returned to his desk and gestured for Daniel to take a seat in one of the large, plush leather chairs across from him. "That's quite admirable, Daniel," Mr. Carter said thoughtfully. "Not many people would have done what you did." Daniel sat down, his feet barely touching the floor. He felt small in the oversized chair, but Mr. Carter's kind words gave him the confidence to sit up straighter. "I appreciate your honesty," Mr. Carter continued as he opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. "I'd like to offer you a reward for your integrity." Daniel's eyes widened, and he quickly shook his head. "Oh, no, sir, I can't accept that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't return the wallet for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Mr. Carter paused, his pen hovering over the checkbook. He looked at Daniel with a mix of surprise and respect. "Are you sure? This is a substantial amount of money. It could help you and your family." For a moment, Daniel thought about his mom working long hours to make ends meet. The temptation flashed in his mind, but then he remembered her words. "Honesty isn't something you trade, Daniel. It's who we are." With a deep breath, Daniel looked Mr. Carter in the eye. "I'm sure, sir. Thank you for the offer, but I can't take money for doing what's right." Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with newfound interest. After a moment, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Daniel Thompson," he said, "you've certainly given me something to think about today." He stood up and extended his hand to Daniel. "Thank you for returning my wallet. Your honesty is refreshing and admirable." Daniel stood as well, shaking Mr. Carter's hand with a firm grip, just like his mom had taught him. "You're welcome, sir," he said, a small smile forming on his face. "I'm just glad I could help." As Daniel left Mr. Carter's office, his heart felt light, and the grand building that had intimidated him earlier now seemed far less imposing. He stepped out onto the busy street, taking a deep breath and feeling proud of the choice he had made. The long walk back to school didn't bother him at all. He replayed the conversation with Mr. Carter in his mind, reassured that he had done the right thing. His mom's words echoed in his thoughts, and he smiled, knowing how proud she would be of him. When Daniel arrived at school, he glanced at his watch and realized just how late he was. His stomach tightened with worry. He'd never been late before, and he didn't want to disappoint his teacher. With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy school doors and made his way to his classroom. Standing outside, he gathered his courage and knocked softly. "Come in," Mrs. Johnson's voice called from inside. Daniel entered the room, his cheeks flushing as all eyes turned to him. Mrs. Johnson looked at him with surprise and concern. "Daniel, this isn't like you to be late," she said, furrowing her brow. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson," Daniel said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I found a wallet on my way to school this morning, and I had to return it to the owner." Mrs. Johnson's expression softened, her concern melting away. "You returned a wallet? That was very responsible of you, Daniel. Would you mind sharing what happened with the class?" Daniel nodded, feeling more at ease as he stood at the front of the room. He recounted his morning, explaining how he had found the wallet and returned it. As he spoke, he noticed his classmates listening intently, their eyes wide with interest. "And that's why I'm late," Daniel finished, looking at Mrs. Johnson apologetically. A smile spread across Mrs. Johnson's face. "Daniel, thank you for sharing that with us. What you did today was incredibly honest and brave. Class, don't you think Daniel set a wonderful example for all of us?" The class erupted into applause, and Daniel's cheeks grew warm with embarrassment. He hadn't expected this reaction, but as he made his way back to his seat, his classmates patted him on the back and whispered words of admiration. Daniel smiled shyly, grateful for their support, but feeling a little overwhelmed by the attention. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself drifting back to the morning's events. The image of Mr. Carter's surprised face kept popping into his mind, but he shook his head and tried to focus on the math problems in front of him. He didn't want his good deed to distract him from his studies. During lunch, his friends bombarded him with questions about the wallet and Mr. Carter. Daniel answered them honestly, but kept his responses short. "It was just the right thing to do," he said with a shrug before taking a bite of his sandwich. In the afternoon, as Mrs. Johnson introduced a new science concept, Daniel caught himself daydreaming about the tall office building and the bustling streets of the city. He blinked hard, trying to refocus on the lesson. He knew his mom would want him to stay focused, no matter what had happened earlier that day. Daniel knew his mom would want him to focus in class, no matter what had happened earlier. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Daniel packed up his backpack, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. He was proud of what he'd done, but the attention it brought left him feeling a bit out of place. All he wanted was for things to go back to normal. On his walk home, Daniel thought about telling his mom what had happened with Mr. Carter. He knew she'd be proud, and that thought made him smile. But as he approached their apartment building, he decided not to make a big fuss about it. He'd tell her, of course, but he would keep it simple. Climbing the stairs to their apartment, Daniel felt the weight of his backpack, now filled with homework. He paused before opening the door, taking a deep breath. He was ready to greet his mom and settle back into his usual after-school routine. The events of the morning already felt like a distant memory as he prepared to focus on the familiar comforts of home. Meanwhile, back in his office, Mr. Thomas Carter sat at his desk, lost in thought. The morning's events kept replaying in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of young Daniel standing in his office, holding out the wallet with such earnest determination. Mr. Carter picked up the wallet again, running his fingers over its leather surface. Everything had been inside: his credit cards, his driver's license, a substantial amount of cash, returned without a single thing missing. "Incredible," Mr. Carter muttered to himself, shaking his head in amazement. What had struck him most wasn't just that the wallet was returned, but that Daniel had refused a reward. In a world where everyone seemed to be out for personal gain, this young boy's actions stood out like a beacon of hope. Leaning back in his chair, Mr. Carter furrowed his brow, deep in thought. He couldn't just let this go. Daniel's honesty and integrity deserved more than just a simple thank you. There had to be something he could do to show his appreciation. "There must be something," Mr. Carter said aloud, tapping his fingers on the desk. He thought about Daniel's appearance, the slightly too small jacket, the scuffed shoes. It was clear the boy came from a modest background. Yet despite what must have been challenging circumstances, Daniel had chosen to do the right thing. Mr. Carter's mind raced with ideas. He could offer financial assistance to Daniel's family, or perhaps set up a college fund. But something told him that Daniel wouldn't want charity. No, it had to be something more meaningful, something that wouldn't undermine the values the boy had demonstrated so clearly. Suddenly, an idea formed in Mr. Carter's mind. He sat up straight, a smile spreading across his face. He knew exactly what he needed to do. Picking up the phone, Mr. Carter dialed the local police station. After explaining the situation, he was connected to Officer Johnson, who listened intently. "That's quite a remarkable young man," Officer Johnson said, his voice filled with admiration. "I'd be happy to help you locate his school." With the officer's assistance, Mr. Carter soon had the name and address of Daniel's school. He thanked the officer and hung up, feeling a surge of excitement. "Sarah," he called to his assistant, "clear my afternoon schedule. I have an important visit to make." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard, a police car and a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of Daniel's school. The sight of the vehicles immediately caught the attention of students, who peered out from their classroom windows, whispers of curiosity spreading like wildfire. Officer Johnson stepped out of the patrol car, followed closely by Mr. Carter as they made their way into the school. Their presence caused a ripple of excitement among the staff and students. Soon enough, they found their way to Daniel's classroom. The teacher was in the middle of a math lesson when a knock on the door interrupted her. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped in, her expression a mix of seriousness and excitement. "Excuse me, Mrs. Davis," she said, addressing the teacher. "Could you please send Daniel Thompson to my office?" A hush fell over the classroom as every eye turned toward Daniel. His heart began to race, his mind scrambling to think of what he could have done wrong. Slowly, he stood up, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. "Daniel," Mrs. Rodriguez added softly, "bring your things with you, please." As Daniel gathered his backpack, his classmates stared at him, some with concern, others with curiosity. His best friend, Jake, gave him a reassuring nod, but it did little to calm Daniel's nerves. Walking down the hallway beside Mrs. Rodriguez, Daniel's imagination went wild. Had something happened to his mom? Was he in trouble for being late to school that morning? The sight of the police car outside hadn't escaped his notice, and it only made his worry grow. As they approached the office, Daniel could see through the glass partition that there were several adults inside, including a police officer. His heart pounded harder, and a lump formed in his throat. Mrs. Rodriguez placed a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder before opening the door. "It's okay, Daniel," she said softly. "You're not in any trouble." Stepping into the office, Daniel's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Standing next to Officer Johnson was Mr. Carter, the man whose wallet he had returned earlier that day. Mr. Carter's face broke into a warm smile as he saw Daniel. For a moment, Daniel forgot to breathe. His heart raced, and his palms grew sweaty as he sat down in the principal's office. The sight of Mr. Carter, Officer Johnson, and Mrs. Rodriguez all looking at him filled his stomach with anxiety. "Please have a seat, Daniel," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Daniel sat down, his mind swirling with possibilities. Had he done something wrong by returning the wallet? Should he have just given it to a teacher instead? Maybe Mr. Carter thought he had taken something from the wallet before returning it. Fear gripped him as the adults exchanged glances. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he blinked rapidly to hold them back. Am I in trouble?" Daniel finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Carter quickly stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Oh no, Daniel, not at all," he said, his voice warm. "I'm sorry if we frightened you. That wasn't our intention." Officer Johnson nodded. "You're not in any trouble, son. Quite the opposite, actually." Despite their reassurances, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his stomach. He looked from one face to another, trying to understand what was going on. Mrs. Rodriguez moved closer and knelt beside Daniel's chair. "Daniel, honey, take a deep breath," she said gently. "I know this is scary, but I promise you're not in any trouble. We just want to talk to you about what happened this morning." Daniel took a shaky breath, but his mind was still racing. Why was there a police officer here just to talk about the wallet? Had he unknowingly done something wrong? As the adults continued to explain the situation, Daniel sat stiffly in his chair, barely hearing their words over the sound of his pounding heart. All he could think about was the fear coursing through him and the desperate hope that he wouldn't let his mom down or get into trouble. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Daniel blurted out, "I didn't steal anything, I swear." His voice cracked as tears filled his eyes. "I just wanted to help. I found the wallet and thought it was right to return it. I'm sorry if I did something wrong." Mr. Carter's eyes widened in surprise, and he quickly knelt down to reassure the frightened boy. No, Daniel, you didn't do anything wrong," he said gently, meeting Daniel's eyes. Officer Johnson stepped forward, his voice softening. "Son, you're not in any trouble. We're here because of your good deed, not because you did anything wrong," Mrs. Rodriguez reassured, patting Daniel's trembling hand. "Daniel, honey, take a deep breath. Everything is okay. Mr. Carter wanted to thank you properly for returning his wallet." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at each adult, trying to understand. "But why is there a police officer here?" he asked softly. Officer Johnson smiled kindly. "I'm here to recognize your honesty, Daniel. What you did was very admirable, and we wanted to make sure you knew that." As they continued explaining, Daniel's tense posture began to relax. The fear that had gripped him was slowly loosening, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "So, I'm not in trouble?" he asked hesitantly. Mr. Carter shook his head, his warm smile spreading across his face. "Not at all, Daniel. In fact, we're here to thank you and celebrate your integrity." Daniel still looked puzzled, but a hint of relief started to settle in. "But sir," he said quietly, "isn't that what anyone would do?" Mr. Carter chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised, Daniel. Not everyone would return a wallet full of money without expecting something in return. Your honesty is rare, and it should be celebrated." Officer Johnson stepped forward, adding, "That's right, son. Mr. Carter asked for our help to find your school, not to get you in trouble, but to make sure we found the right Daniel Thompson." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. "Mr. Carter wanted to thank you properly, Daniel. He thought it was important to recognize your good deed in front of your classmates and teachers." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" he whispered. Mr. Carter nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Really, Daniel, what you did deserves recognition. Your honesty and integrity are qualities that should be celebrated and encouraged." A small smile began to spread across Daniel's face as the reality of the situation sank in. The fear he had felt earlier melted away, replaced by a warm sense of pride and relief. "So," Mr. Carter continued, clapping his hands together, "if you're okay with it, we'd like to gather your classmates and teachers for a special assembly. We want everyone to know about your act of kindness and honesty." Daniel's heart raced as he stood in front of the packed school assembly. The gym was buzzing with excitement, students whispering and trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Mr. Carter stood beside Daniel, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Students and teachers," Mr. Carter's voice boomed through the microphone, "we are here today to celebrate an extraordinary act of honesty and integrity." He retold the story of how Daniel had found and returned his wallet. As Mr. Carter spoke, Daniel's cheeks grew warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. He glanced at his mother, who sat in the front row, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "Daniel's actions touched me deeply," Mr. Carter continued. "In a world where it's easy to look the other way or think only of oneself, Daniel chose to do the right thing. And that, my friends, deserves recognition." The gym fell silent, all eyes on Mr. Carter and Daniel. "That's why I've decided to do something special," Mr. Carter announced, his voice full of emotion. "I want to ensure that Daniel's future is as bright as his character. I'm going to sponsor Daniel's education all the way through college." A collective gasp echoed through the gym, followed by thunderous applause. Daniel stood in shock, unable to believe what he was hearing. But Mr. Carter wasn't done. "And that's not all," he said, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. "In honor of Daniel's integrity, I am establishing the Daniel Thompson Scholarship Fund. This fund will provide opportunities for other young people who demonstrate the same kind of honesty and character that Daniel has shown." The gym erupted into cheers. Daniel's classmates jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting his name. His mother rushed forward, hugging him tightly, tears of joy soaking his shoulder. As the noise began to die down, Mr. Carter turned to Daniel. "Your small act of kindness has created a ripple effect, Daniel. You've not only changed your own life, but potentially the lives of many others. Never underestimate the power of doing the right thing." The gym was still buzzing with excitement as the students absorbed the magnitude of Mr. Carter's announcement. Principal Johnson, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward with a look of awe on his face. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the assembly. "I think we can all agree that this is an extraordinary moment for our school," he said, beaming at Daniel. "Daniel, you've made us all proud today." Teachers exchanged amazed glances. Mrs. Rodriguez, Daniel's homeroom teacher, wiped a tear from her eye. She had always known Daniel was special, but this was beyond what she had ever imagined. The students, too, were overcome with excitement. The older kids, who usually tried to act cool, couldn't help but join in the celebration. A chant started from the back of the gym. "Daniel! Daniel! Daniel!" The chant quickly spread throughout the crowd. In the midst of the chaos, Daniel stood, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He had never been the center of attention like this before, and he wasn't sure how to react. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the smiling faces of his teachers and the excited grins of his classmates. Even Mr. Thompson, the strict history teacher known for his no-nonsense attitude, stood up and began a slow clap. "This, students," he said loudly, "is what true character looks like." The atmosphere in the gym had completely transformed. What had started as a nerve-wracking experience for Daniel had become a celebration of his integrity. The air was filled with pride and joy. As the cheering continued, Principal Johnson raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, though he couldn't hide the grin on his face. "I think it's safe to say this is a day none of us will ever forget." Just as the excitement in the gym began to settle, Principal Johnson's phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer it, his eyebrows raising in surprise. When he returned to the group, he announced, "It seems word travels fast. The local news station wants to do a story on Daniel's act of kindness." Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never imagined that returning a wallet would lead to all this attention. Mr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You deserve this recognition, Daniel. Your honesty is something to be celebrated." Within an hour, the school was buzzing with even more activity. A news van pulled up outside, and reporters with cameras and microphones made their way into the building. The principal's office became an impromptu interview room, with Daniel and Mr. Carter seated side by side. Sarah Chun, a popular local news anchor, smiled encouragingly at Daniel. "So, Daniel," she began, "can you tell us what went through your mind when you found Mr. Carter's wallet?" Daniel swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he faced the camera. "I just knew I had to return it," Daniel said softly, his voice calm as he recounted the story. With each word, his confidence grew. Mr. Carter chimed in, expressing his admiration for Daniel's integrity. The reporter listened with shining eyes, clearly moved by the boy's actions. Outside the office, students crowded the windows, eager to catch a glimpse of their now famous classmate. Teachers gently nudged them away, but it was hard to hide their pride and excitement. As the interview wrapped up, Sarah Chin turned to the camera with a bright smile. In a world where negativity often makes headlines, young Daniel Thompson reminds us that honesty and integrity are still alive and well. This is Sarah Chun, reporting from Lincoln Middle School, where a small act of kindness has made a huge impact. As the news van pulled away from the school, Daniel's mind was buzzing with the events of the day. He couldn't wait to tell his mom everything that had happened. When the final bell rang, he sprinted home, his backpack bouncing against his back. Bursting through the front door, breathless and eyes sparkling with excitement, Daniel shouted, "Mom! Mom!" Lisa, his mother, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Daniel, what's wrong, baby?" she asked, worry creasing her forehead. Without pausing, Daniel launched into his story. He told her everything: finding Mr. Carter's wallet, the surprise visit to the school, and the scholarship. As the word spilled out, Lisa's expression shifted from concern to disbelief, and finally, to overwhelming pride. By the time Daniel finished, tears were welling in her eyes. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you. So proud." Daniel buried his face in his mother's shoulder, feeling safe and loved. "I just did what you always taught me to do, Mom," he mumbled. Lisa held him at arm's length, looking into his eyes. "You did the right thing, baby. You're growing into such a wonderful young man." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. Lisa opened it to find Mrs. Cruz, their neighbor, standing there with a huge smile on her face. "I just saw the news," Mrs. Cruz exclaimed. "Daniel, you're a hero." Word spread quickly through their tight-knit community. Soon, neighbors began gathering outside Daniel and Lisa's apartment, eager to congratulate the young boy who had made them proud. Mr. Jenkins from the corner store arrived with a cake, and the Patel family from across the street brought colorful balloons. Even grumpy old Mr. Simmons from the first floor showed up, wearing a rare smile. The apartment was soon filled with laughter and chatter as neighbors squeezed in to celebrate Daniel's honesty. Overwhelmed by the attention, Daniel stayed close to his mother's side. Eventually, he found a quiet corner in the living room, sitting in his favorite worn armchair. From there, he watched his neighbors laugh and talk, the scene before him feeling almost dreamlike. He thought back to that morning when he'd found Mr. Carter's wallet, the weight of it in his hands, and the brief moment of temptation when he saw the cash inside. The thought of keeping it had disappeared as quickly as it had come. Returning the wallet had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Now, surrounded by the warmth and pride of his community, Daniel felt a swirl of emotions. He was happy, of course, but also a little overwhelmed. Everyone kept calling him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He'd just done what his mom had always taught him was right. As he watched his mother moving through the crowd, her eyes bright with pride, Daniel felt a new weight settle on his shoulders, a sense of responsibility. People were looking at him differently now, expecting great things from him. The scholarship Mr. Carter had offered was a huge deal, a chance for a better future, but it also felt like a lot of pressure. Taking a deep breath, Daniel tried to steady his racing thoughts. He knew that deep down, nothing had really changed. He was still the same Daniel, just a kid who tried to do the right thing. But the scholarship and all the attention made him nervous. What if he couldn't live up to everyone's expectations? What if he let them down? Sensing his unease, Lisa made her way over to him. She knelt beside the armchair, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You okay, baby?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, Ma. Just thinking." Lisa squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Remember, Daniel, you don't have to be perfect. Just keep being you, that's more than enough." Her words washed over Daniel like a warm blanket, easing some of his worries. He nodded, feeling lighter. Maybe he didn't have all the answers right now, but he knew he'd figure it out, one step at a time. In the days that followed the celebration, Mr. Carter found himself deeply moved by Daniel's simple yet powerful act of kindness. He couldn't shake the image of the humble young boy and his unwavering integrity. As he sat in his luxurious office, surrounded by the symbols of his success, Mr. Carter knew he had to do more than just offer a scholarship. With a renewed sense of purpose, he called his team of lawyers and financial advisors. "I want to set up a scholarship fund," he announced, his voice resolute. "Not just for Daniel, but for other children like him who show exceptional character." Over the next few weeks, Mr. Carter worked tirelessly to bring his vision to life. He reviewed documents, made countless phone calls, and held meeting after meeting. The scholarship fund began to take shape, not just for academic achievement, but to recognize acts of kindness, honesty, and community service. But Mr. Carter didn't stop there. As he learned more about Daniel's neighborhood, he realized that a scholarship alone wasn't enough. The children needed more immediate support and opportunities. "We need to build a community center," he told his team one afternoon. "A place where kids can go after school, where they can learn, play, and grow." The idea quickly gained momentum. Mr. Carter envisioned a bright, welcoming space with a library, computer lab, and sports facilities, a beacon of hope for the neighborhood. He wanted it to be a place where potential could be nurtured, just as he had seen in Daniel. As the plans for the community center took shape, Mr. Carter felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself visiting Daniel's neighborhood more often, talking with residents and community leaders to ensure the center would meet the area's needs. What had started as a simple gesture to reward Daniel's honesty was now becoming something much bigger, a legacy of kindness and opportunity. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony finally arrived, bringing a sense of excitement and hope to Daniel's neighborhood. The sun shone brightly, as if celebrating the occasion. Daniel stood nervously beside his mother, adjusting the collar of his new shirt. He still couldn't believe all of this was happening because of him. His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. Mr. Carter arrived, looking sharp in his suit but with his sleeves rolled up, ready to get to work. He greeted Daniel and his mother warmly, then shook hands with the community leaders who had gathered for the event. The crowd quieted as Mr. Carter stepped up to the microphone. "Today," he began, his voice clear and strong, "we're not just breaking ground on a building. We're laying the foundation for a brighter future." He explained the center's mission to foster kindness and community spirit. "And who better to name it after," Mr. Carter added with a smile, "than the young man whose honesty inspired it all." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise as Mr. Carter unveiled a sign that read, "The Daniel Thompson Community Center." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and embarrassment. As the ceremony continued, local leaders spoke about the impact the center would have on the neighborhood. Daniel listened intently, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. When it was time for the symbolic groundbreaking, Mr. Carter handed Daniel a small, shiny shovel. "Would you do the honors?" he asked. With trembling hands, Daniel took the shovel and stepped forward. Daniel looked out at the crowd, his neighbors, teachers, and even some of his classmates. Cameras flashed as he nervously pushed the shovel into the soft earth, turning over the first scoop of dirt. The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time that day, Daniel couldn't help but smile. Standing there with the shovel in his hands, he realized that his small act of returning a wallet had set off a chain of events that would forever change his community. As the applause died down, Mr. Carter turned to Daniel with a warm smile. "Daniel, would you like to say a few words?" he asked, gesturing toward the microphone. Daniel's eyes widened, and he felt his heart skip a beat. A speech? He hadn't expected that. His palms grew sweaty, and he glanced nervously at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes full of love and pride. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the young boy who had sparked this incredible transformation. For a moment, Daniel froze, overwhelmed by the sea of faces. But then he thought about the wallet and how doing the right thing had led to this moment, and suddenly, the words began to flow. "Hi, everyone," Daniel began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I'm not used to speaking in front of so many people, but I just want to thank you all for being here today." He paused to gather his thoughts. "When I found Mr. Carter's wallet that day, I didn't think I was doing anything special. I just knew it was the right thing to do. My mom always taught me that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference." The crowd nodded and smiled in agreement as Daniel continued. "I never imagined that returning a wallet would lead to all of this." He gestured toward the construction site behind him. "It just goes to show that doing the right thing, no matter how small it seems, can have a big impact." His voice grew more confident as he spoke from his heart. "This community center is going to help so many people, and I'm honored that it will bear my name." But really, it belongs to all of us. It's a reminder that we all have the power to make our community better, one small act at a time. Daniel's eyes found his mother's in the crowd, and he saw tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "I want to thank my mom for always teaching me to do the right thing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want to thank Mr. Carter for his incredible generosity. But most of all, I want to thank everyone here for your support and for believing in the power of kindness." As Daniel finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause once again. Mr. Carter patted him on the back, beaming with pride, while Daniel's mother rushed forward to give him a tight, tearful hug. After the applause settled, Mr. Carter stepped forward once more, his face glowing with purpose. Placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, he turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have one more announcement to make today. In honor of Daniel's incredible act of integrity, I am establishing a scholarship fund in his name." A murmur of excitement spread through the audience. Daniel's eyes widened in shock, and his mother gasped softly beside him. "The Daniel Thompson Integrity Scholarship," Mr. Carter continued, "will provide educational opportunities to students who demonstrate the same kind of honesty and moral courage that Daniel has shown us all. Each year, we will select deserving students who have gone above and beyond in their commitment to doing what's right, no matter the circumstances." He paused, allowing the news to sink in. "This scholarship will cover full tuition for college or vocational training, ensuring that these outstanding young individuals have the chance to further their education and become leaders in our community." Daniel stood there, stunned by the magnitude of what Mr. Carter had just announced. He felt a wave of emotions, pride, humility, and a sense of responsibility, as his mother squeezed his hand, tears of joy streaming down her face. Mr. Carter continued, "We will be working closely with local schools to identify candidates who exemplify integrity in their daily lives. The scholarship will be open to students from all backgrounds, with a special focus on those who might not otherwise have the means to pursue higher education." He then turned to Daniel, his eyes twinkling. "Daniel, your one act of honesty has now created a ripple effect that will change lives for years to come. This scholarship ensures that your legacy of integrity will continue to inspire and support others long into the future." The crowd once again erupted into applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Daniel was overwhelmed by the impact his simple act had created. He looked up at Mr. Carter, gratitude shining in his eyes, unable to find the words to express how deeply touched he was. The following Monday, Daniel returned to school. His heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves as he walked through the hallways. Whispers followed him, smiles from classmates, and even a few pats on the back. His peers congratulated him on his honesty, and by the time the first bell rang, Daniel felt a little more at ease. Instead of heading to their regular classes, all students were directed to the school auditorium. Daniel followed the crowd, unsure of what was happening. As soon as he stepped inside, a thunderous applause greeted him. The entire school, students, teachers, and staff, had gathered for a special assembly in his honor. Daniel's face flushed with both embarrassment and pride as he realized that this celebration was all for him. The principal stood at the podium with a warm smile. "Today, we are here to celebrate one of our own," she began. "Daniel Thompson has shown us all what it means to have true integrity." Daniel sat in the front row, his hands fidgeting in his lap as the principal recounted the story of how he had found and returned Mr. Carter's wallet. His classmates listened closely, nodding in approval. "Daniel's actions remind us that even small acts of honesty can have a big impact," the principal continued. "He has brought honor not just to himself, but to our entire school community." She then called Daniel to the stage. His legs shook as he made his way up, and the principal presented him with a beautifully framed certificate. "This certificate is to honor Daniel Thompson for his outstanding display of integrity and honesty," she read aloud. The auditorium exploded with cheers and applause. Daniel stood there, holding the certificate, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He felt proud, yet humbled, knowing he had simply done what he believed was right. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel adjusted to his newfound role in the community. The initial shock of sudden fame faded, replaced by a quiet determination to live up to the expectations placed upon him. He continued to excel in his studies, and his teachers noticed a new spark of confidence, not arrogance, but a deeper understanding of his own potential. One day during lunch break, Daniel overheard some classmates talking about a local animal shelter in need of volunteers. Without hesitation, he approached them and asked how he could help. The following Saturday, Daniel found himself at the shelter, cleaning cages and walking dogs. The joy he felt in helping those animals was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. This first taste of community service sparked something in Daniel, a desire to keep making a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. Daniel began seeking more opportunities to give back, driven by a desire to continue making a difference. He joined his school's environmental club, taking part in neighborhood cleanup drives on the weekends. He also volunteered at the community center that now bore his name, helping younger kids with their homework and organizing activities. His mother, Lisa, watched with pride and amazement. She had always known Daniel was special, but seeing him blossom into a community leader at such a young age filled her heart with joy. As Daniel became more involved in various projects, his enthusiasm and dedication inspired others. His classmates, who had once only admired him from afar, started joining him in his volunteer efforts. The ripple effect of Daniel's actions spread throughout the school and the neighborhood. Despite his growing responsibilities and schedule, Daniel remained grounded. He never forgot the values that had led him to return Mr. Carter's wallet. He stayed humble, quick to deflect praise, and always focused on the causes he cared about. One evening at the dinner table, Daniel's mother asked him how he felt about all the changes in his life. Daniel paused, thinking carefully before responding. "You know, Mom, at first I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't know if I could be what everyone wanted me to be. But then I realized I'm just being myself. I'm doing what you always taught me, to be kind and help others. It feels good, and it feels right." As the months passed, Mr. Carter found himself spending more and more time at the community center he had helped establish. What had begun as a gesture of gratitude toward Daniel had evolved into a genuine passion for making a difference in the lives of young people. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Mr. Carter would leave his office early, swap his suit for casual clothes, and head to the center. The children's faces would light up when they saw him arrive, always ready with a kind word or helping hand. Mr. Carter took a special interest in mentoring the youth at the center. He organized workshops on financial literacy, career planning, and entrepreneurship, eager to share his knowledge and experience. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as he spoke, and the kids soaked up his wisdom. But the most meaningful relationship he developed was with Daniel. Mr. Carter saw in Daniel a reflection of his younger self, driven, compassionate, and full of potential. He took Daniel under his wing, offering not just academic guidance but life lessons as well. Their bond grew stronger with each passing week. After activities at the center, they would often sit together, discussing Daniel's dreams and aspirations. Mr. Carter listened intently, offering advice and encouragement. For Daniel, Mr. Carter became more than just a mentor. He filled a void that Daniel hadn't even realized was there. While his mother had always been his rock, there was something special about having a father figure to look up to. One Saturday afternoon, after a busy day cleaning up after a community event at the center, Mr. Carter placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You know, Daniel," he said warmly, "I'm proud of you, not just for returning my wallet that day, but for everything you've done since. You're a remarkable young man." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the emotions those words stirred in him. He looked up at Mr. Carter, his eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he said softly, "for everything." As time went on, Mr. Carter gave Daniel more responsibilities. One bright Saturday morning, while organizing a neighborhood cleanup, Mr. Carter turned to Daniel with a smile. "Daniel, why don't you take charge of the group cleaning up the park?" Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Carter smiled reassuringly. "I'm positive. You've got what it takes, son. Just remember to listen to your team and lead by example. Taking a deep breath, Daniel nodded and gathered his group. Though nervous at first, as he started assigning tasks and working alongside his peers, a newfound confidence began to blossom within him. Mr. Carter watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride as Daniel encouraged his teammates, praised their efforts, and even found creative solutions to small problems that arose. It reminded Mr. Carter of his own early days in business. Later that day, after the event wrapped up, they sat on a bench enjoying some well-deserved lemonade. Mr. Carter turned to Daniel. "You did a fantastic job today, Daniel. You're a natural leader." Daniel beamed with pride. "Thanks, Mr. Carter. I've learned from the best." Mr. Carter chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "You know, Daniel, I may be teaching you about leadership and responsibility, but you're teaching me something too." "What's that?" Daniel asked, curiosity shining in his eyes. "You're reminding me of the joy of making a difference," Mr. Carter replied softly. "In the business world, it's easy to forget what really matters. But seeing you grow and seeing the impact of our work here, it's given me a new perspective on life." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, understanding the weight of Mr. Carter's words. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both feeling grateful for the friendship and mentorship they had found in one another. As the months passed, the impact of Daniel's honesty and the new community center began to ripple throughout the neighborhood. What had once been a struggling area now showed signs of transformation, all sparked by a simple act of kindness. The community center, known as Daniel's Place, became a hub of activity and hope. Children who once roamed the streets after school now had a safe space to study, play, and learn new skills. The center offered tutoring programs, art classes, and even computer skills workshops for adults looking to improve their job prospects. Mrs. Thompson, Daniel's mother, noticed the changes on her daily walks to work. The streets seemed cleaner, and there was a newfound sense of pride among the residents. She often saw neighbors picking up litter or attending to garden patches that had sprung up along the sidewalks. Local businesses began to thrive as well. The increased foot traffic around the community center brought more customers to nearby shops. Mr. Johnson, who owned the corner store, had to hire an extra hand to keep up with demand. The scholarship fund set up in Daniel's name was already making a difference. Sarah, a bright young girl from Daniel's school, had received the first scholarship. Her parents, who had always struggled to make ends meet, were overjoyed that their daughter could now pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. Even the once neglected local park was now filled with the sounds of children playing and families enjoying picnics. The cleanup efforts led by Daniel and Mr. Carter had inspired the community to take ownership of their shared spaces. As word spread about the positive changes in the neighborhood, more volunteers and resources poured in. A local tech company donated computers to the community center, while a group of retired teachers volunteered their time for the tutoring program. Daniel, now entering his early teens, watched in awe as his community transformed around him. He knew that this was only the beginning, and he remained committed to the values that had brought him to this point: honesty, kindness, and the power of doing what's right. As Daniel observed the changes in his community, he felt a mix of awe and humility. He never could have imagined that his simple decision to return a wallet would lead to such a profound transformation. Yet, as he walked through the bustling community center or helped younger kids with their homework, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride and responsibility. Now entering his final year of high school, Daniel stood on the threshold of a bright future. The once shy boy who had stumbled upon a wallet years ago had grown into a confident young man, respected by his peers and beloved by his community. Every day after school, Daniel continued his routine of spending time at the community center, mentoring younger children and assisting with the various programs. Surrounded by the fruits of his small act of kindness, Daniel often found himself thinking about what lay ahead. One afternoon, as he sat in the center's library, his eyes drifted to a stack of college brochures. His heart raced with both excitement and a touch of nervousness. College had once seemed like a distant dream, but now, thanks to the scholarship fund that bore his name, it was within reach. Mrs. Thompson noticed her son's thoughtful expression as she entered the library. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Daniel looked up at his mother, his eyes shining with hope. "Mom, I think I want to study social work in college. I want to learn how to help communities like ours even more," he said, his voice steady. Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, pride filling her heart. "Oh, Daniel," she said, pulling him into a warm embrace. "You've already done so much, and I know you're going to do even greater things." Later that week, during one of their regular mentoring sessions, Daniel shared his aspirations with Mr. Carter. The businessman listened intently, a proud smile spreading across his face. "Daniel," Mr. Carter began, leaning forward in his chair, "I've watched you grow into an exceptional young man. Your dedication to this community is inspiring. Whatever path you choose, I have no doubt you'll make a significant impact." Encouraged by the unwavering support of his mother and Mr. Carter, Daniel threw himself into his college applications. He spent hours crafting essays about his experiences, his dreams, and his passion for helping others. Each word he wrote carried the weight of gratitude for the opportunities he had been given and his determination to create even more for others. As Daniel worked tirelessly toward his goals, the community center buzzed with activity around him, a constant reminder of the ripple effect his one small act had set in motion. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had the support of his family, his mentor, and his entire community. One evening, as the sun began to set on a warm summer day, Daniel, his mother, and Mr. Carter gathered around a small table in the Thompsons' modest kitchen. The familiar scent of Mrs. Thompson's famous pot roast filled the room, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread. Daniel couldn't help but smile as he looked at the two people who had been his biggest supporters throughout his journey. His mother's eyes twinkled with pride, while Mr. Carter, relaxed in casual attire, helped set the table. As they began to eat, a comfortable silence settled over the room. Finally, Mr. Carter broke the quiet, his voice warm and reflective. "You know," he said, gesturing around the room, "I never imagined that losing my wallet would lead to all of this." Mrs. Thompson nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze her son's hand. "Daniel's always had a good heart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But that day, when he decided to return your wallet, it changed everything for us." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat as he looked between his mother and Mr. Carter. "I was just doing what I thought was right," he said softly, still humbled by the impact of his decision. Mr. Carter leaned forward, his eyes serious but kind. "That's exactly why it was so special, Daniel. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it was the right thing to do." As they continued their meal, the conversation turned to reminiscing about the past few years, the opening of the community center, Daniel's growth as both a student and a leader, and the positive changes they had witnessed in the neighborhood. Daniel looked around the table, his heart full of gratitude. He saw the proud smile on his mother's face, one she wore every time she looked at him, and he saw the fatherly affection in Mr. Carter's eyes, a bond that had only deepened over time. "You know," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I used to think returning the wallet was just a small thing, but now I see how it brought us all together and changed our lives." Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye, nodding. "It's amazing how one act of kindness can ripple out and touch so many lives," she said softly. Mr. Carter nodded in agreement. "And it's not over yet, Daniel. Your journey is just beginning." Daniel smiled, feeling a deep sense of warmth and purpose wash over him. He knew that no matter what the future held, he had made a difference, and he was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed Daniel's story and the incredible bond that grew between him and Mr. Carter, I have handpicked another heartwarming tale just for you. Click here to watch the next inspiring story that will touch your heart.